Lillian clutched the stack of files in her arms as she strode down the marble hallway of the Werewolf Congress, keeping her steps steady even though her pulse was anything but. Her job wasn't high-ranking, just another ordinary staffer in the Medical and Public Health Division. But today, she was about to give a report to someone far from ordinary, Sebastian, Prince of the Moonlight Kingdom, the strongest son of the Lycan Alpha, the man most likely to inherit the throne. People said he was intimidating as hell, sharp, calculating, always in control, cold-blooded, ruthless when necessary, and worst of all, undeniably, dangerously wolf. As a mere human, Lillian had never been comfortable around wolves. Their predatory energy, the way they carried themselves like they owned the world, the way they looked at you like they already knew your next move. It made her uneasy. But she had no choice. The kingdom's medical reform was in motion, and she had been assigned to handle the project's data analysis. That meant she had to face the new prince head-on. The moment she pushed open the meeting room door, she felt it. Heat, a gaze, locked onto her. Slowly, she lifted her head and met a pair of deep, midnight dark eyes. Sebastian sat at the head of the conference table, perfectly poised in a black suit that fit like a second skin, broad shoulders cutting an effortlessly commanding figure. Long fingers tapped rhythmically against the table, a lazy motion, but one that somehow carried the weight of authority. His features were razor-sharp, his expression unreadable, but his gaze held something else, something dangerous, like a wolf watching his prey, waiting, calculating. Lillian's spine went stiff. Her grip on the files tightened just slightly. "Sit." Sebastian's voice was deep, smooth, but laced with an undeniable authority. A voice that demanded obedience. Pushing aside the odd flutter in her chest, Lillian pulled out a chair, sat, and flipped open her files. "Regarding the ongoing medical reform initiative, I've compiled a comprehensive data analysis." Her voice was steady, professional. She had prepared for this. But as she spoke, she felt it. That heat. That gaze. Still locked on her. Sebastian wasn't just listening. He was studying her. Not the papers. Her. Lillian kept her expression neutral, but deep down, something stirred, unsettled. Why was he watching her like that? It wasn't the usual glance over. It was something sharper, something invasive, something consuming. Like he was memorizing every detail, like he was trying to catch her scent. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to ignore it, to stay focused. But then, he spoke. "How long did it take you to compile this data?" His tone wasn't rushed, but it was sharp, intentional. Lillian blinked. 3 days. Too slow. His brow lifted slightly, and his words landed like a slap. She hesitated, fingers tightening beneath the table. Did he even look at the report? She met his gaze, straight, unflinching. "Your Highness, if this isn't fast enough, then tell me exactly what you're looking for. I'll adjust my approach." Sebastian's lips curled slightly. Not a smirk, something deeper. He tapped his fingers against the table once, eyes narrowing. And then, he smiled. A slow, knowing, damn near predatory smile. "You've got some nerve talking back to me." Lillian froze. There was something dangerous in his voice, something dark, edged with control. She could feel it. He didn't like being challenged, especially not in a meeting where he was supposed to be the one in charge, but she didn't back down. Instead, she met his gaze head-on, unwavering. The room felt thicker, heavier, like the air itself had tensed. Sebastian's stare deepened, and then, just for a second, his wolf stirred. The meeting ended. Lillian stepped out, her breathing a little uneven. She needed a second, needed to shake it off, but she couldn't. That look he gave her, that undeniable intensity, it clung to her skin like heat. She could still feel it. That was what it felt like to be hunted. The stories came flooding back, about Lycan Alpha's son, about what happens when he sets his sights on something. Possessiveness, obsession, A wolf doesn't just want, a wolf takes. She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. No way. She was human. He was the future Lycan Alpha. There's no way he'd be interested in her. Right? Lillian! A familiar voice yanked her from her thoughts. She turned. Her boyfriend Jason was standing there, arms crossed, expression tight. You just met with Sebastian? He asked carefully, watching her face. She nodded. Yeah, it was work. Jason hesitated. Did he say anything to you? Something about the way he asked made her frown. What exactly are you getting at? Jason ran a hand through his hair, glancing around before lowering his voice. Lillian, you need to stay away from him. She blinked. Excuse me? His jaw tensed. He's the Lycan Alpha's son. He's royalty. You think he actually gives a damn about you? He's just playing with you. His tone was sharp, laced with something that sounded an awful lot like jealousy. Lillian's expression hardened. We work together. That's it. Don't make this into something it's not. Jason's fists clenched. I know guys like him, Lillian. He's not serious about you. We're both human. I'm the one who actually makes sense for you. His hand shot out, reaching for hers. But then, a wave of pressure slammed into the space around them. Jason's hand froze midair. His face drained of color. And Lillian. And there, in the shadowed hallway, stood Sebastian. Watching. He moved in, slowly, each step deliberate, each step heavy with undeniable dominance. The air itself seemed to tighten, like the entire hallway was holding its breath. Then he stopped, right in front of Jason, towering over him. His stare was cold, unreadable, but the pressure behind it was suffocating. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost casual, but the weight of it crashed down like a goddamn hammer. You think I'm just playing with her? Jason flinched. Sebastian hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. The sheer power in those words alone was enough to send a full-body shudder down Jason's spine. Lillian saw it, his fingers trembling at his sides. And suddenly, she understood. Sebastian wasn't bluffing. That look in his eyes, it was pure, undiluted possession. This wasn't just an interest. This was a claim. And Lillian? She'd just gotten herself tangled up with a man far more dangerous than she ever realized. Next. Business trip. The city skyline stretched wide beneath the black night sky. Neon signs flickering over the busy streets of eastern Moonlight Kingdom. Lillian adjusted her coat, pulling it tighter around her as she followed Sebastian into an exclusive private club. This wasn't just a business trip. This was an undercover investigation. A pharmaceutical company with direct ties to the Congress had been flagged for illegal werewolf experimentation. And tonight, they were going to figure out exactly how deep the corruption ran. They were led to a VIP suite, dimly lit with gold accents, plush seating, and walls built to keep conversations private. A server poured red wine into their crystal glasses. The deep crimson swirled under the soft glow of the lights, glinting like liquid rubies. Sebastian leaned back, fingers tapping against the table. They won't make a move tonight. We wait. Lillian nodded, trying to ignore the tight coil of tension in her gut. She never quite felt safe around him. Not in a way that screamed danger, but in a way that constantly reminded her of what he was. A predator, a hunter, a man whose entire presence was impossible to ignore. The weight of his wolf aura pressed against her at all times, reminding her that he wasn't just her boss. He was the kind of man who took what he wanted. The moment the wine touched her lips, she barely noticed the taste. Bitter, with a lingering sweetness underneath. Sebastian was watching her. His eyes didn't leave her mouth. She swallowed, setting the glass down, pretending not to notice the way he was studying every move she made. Drink slower. Lillian raised an eyebrow, brushing it off. It's just wine. She had far bigger problems tonight than a little alcohol. But then, something was off. Heat crept up her spine, cooling low in her stomach. Her fingertips twitched slightly against the table, her breath hitching. Why was it suddenly so damn warm? Her pulse kicked up. Her vision swam. She glanced at Sebastian and found him staring back at her. His grip on his wineglass had tightened, knuckles white, veins visible against his skin. His chest rose and fell a little too deeply. And then she saw it. His pupils, blown wide. A flicker of realization shot through her. Something was very, very wrong. They'd been set up. There was something in the damn wine. Lillian! Sebastian's voice was low, rough, strained like he was holding back something primal, something barely leashed. Lillian's head was spinning. Her body was burning, like an invisible fire was licking at her skin, unraveling her from the inside out. Sebastian, Her voice came out weak, breathless, her vision swimming with heat. She tried to stand, but her legs buckled beneath her, completely useless. She collapsed back onto the couch, her body trembling, too warm, too aware of every nerve ending lighting up inside her. Sebastian wasn't doing much better. His fingers were white-knuckled around the table's edge, his breath heavy, his pupils blown so wide, his amber irises were barely visible. His fangs had lengthened. His claws had dug into the wood, splintering it. Fuck! He knew what this was. An aphrodisiac. Not just any aphrodisiac, one designed for Lycans. A drug that didn't just create heat. It ripped apart control, dragging out every suppressed instinct, every animal urge. Sebastian cursed under his breath, sweat breaking at his temple, his throat working hard to suppress the snarl that threatened to escape. His wolf was awake, and it wanted her. Sebastian! Lillian reached for him, her fingers brushing against his wrist. The second she touched him, he nearly lost it. His jaw clenched, his control snapping thread by thread. Lillian was burning up, her body moving toward his on instinct, her scent thick, intoxicating, making it impossible to breathe, impossible to think. She shouldn't be this close. She shouldn't be pressing against him like this, her hands sliding up his chest, seeking the heat of his skin through his shirt. But she was. And Sebastian was done holding back. Do you even know what you're doing? His voice was nothing but a low, guttural growl. She didn't answer, didn't have to. Her fingers tightened in his shirt, her breath shuddering out in a soft, needy whimper, and that sound shattered the last of his fucking control. With a sharp curse, he grabbed her, flipped her beneath him, pressing her into the couch. His weight, his heat, the raw dominance of his body caging hers. It hit her all at once. Lillian! Then, he kissed her, hard, deep, devouring. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a claim. Possessive, demanding, absolute. Lillian gasped, her fingers clawing at his shoulders. But he didn't let her go. He only pulled her deeper. His tongue swept into her mouth, dominating, relentless, drawing out every sound she couldn't suppress. Her body arched, her skin fever-hot, and the moment she whimpered his name against his lips. Sebastian snapped. His hands were on her, everywhere, sliding down her waist, fingers tracing the bare skin beneath her blouse, gripping, claiming, dragging her against him. Fuck! Her moan sent heat crashing through his veins, his body strung so tight he felt like he was going to break. His wolf was roaring. Take her, now make her yours. And God help him, he was going to. Sebastian's voice was low, rough, dangerous. He was at his limit. If she didn't answer him right now, he was going to lose every last shred of control he had left. Lillian's mind was already gone, drowned in the heat, in the overwhelming pull between them. Her lips trembled, parting just slightly. A soft, barely there sound, but it wrecked him. The second she made that tiny, breathless noise, his restraint shattered. The next day, morning light crept through the curtains, painting the room in soft gold. But the heat still lingered. Thick, stifling, drenched in last night's hunger. Lillian's eyes fluttered open. her body aching in ways she didn't know were possible. Everything felt too warm, too sensitive. Her thighs burned. Her skin was covered in faint, lingering bruises, marks left by a wolf who had refused to hold back. But that wasn't the worst of it, because then she saw it. A bite on her shoulder. Her breath hitched. She sat up fast, fingers brushing over the mark. A clear imprint of his teeth, deep enough to sting, but healed just enough to brand her. A wolf's mark, a claim. Her pulse slammed against her ribs. He marked me. She was human. Wolves weren't supposed to mark humans. This wasn't supposed to be possible. Her heart pounded as she turned, and there he was. Sebastian was still asleep, half buried in the sheets, his bare chest rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. Without his usual ice-cold expression, he looked different. Less controlled, more raw, more dangerous, and her body betrayed her immediately. Heat rushed to her cheeks, memories slamming into her like a tidal wave. His hands, rough and demanding. His breath, hot against her neck. The way he pinned her down, took her apart, buried his teeth in her skin like he was never going to let her go. She bit down on her lip, her whole body flushing. Oh God, what the hell was she supposed to do now? She needed to leave. Now, moving slowly, she started slipping out from under the covers, careful not to wake him. But the second she moved, his eyes snapped open, locked onto her like a predator catching his prey. Her breath caught. "Where do you think you're going?" His voice was thick with sleep, husky and dangerous, edged with something else, something possessive. Before she could react, his arm shot out, yanking her back, straight into his fucking chest. She let out a sharp gasp, colliding with his heat, his muscles, his scent. Trapped, completely trapped. "Sebastian!" she choked out, her face burning, hands bracing against his chest. "Let me go." He didn't budge, didn't even try. Instead, he smirked, slow, lazy, and smug as hell. "I had you all night, Lillian, and now you want to act like it didn't happen?" Her stomach flipped. Oh, she was so screwed! Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. Sebastian's gaze flickered lower, to her shoulder, to the mark, his mark. A slow growl rumbled deep in his chest, his fingers sliding along her skin, grazing over the bite. His wolf stirred, because she wasn't just his for the night. She was his. No one else could touch her now. No one else could have her. Ever. "Sebastian, she stammered, trying to explain, trying to say something, anything. But he didn't give her the chance. In one swift move, he flipped her beneath him, caging her against the bed, his breath hot against her ear. "You really think you can run from me?" His voice was lower now, darker, the voice of a wolf who had just claimed his mate. That afternoon, Werewolf Congress, Medical and Public Health Division. The conference room was stiflingly tense. Lillian sat at the lower end of the long table, keeping her head down, trying to make herself look as unbothered as possible. Trying to ignore the heat still lingering on her skin. Trying to hide the marks, the faint, undeniable proof of last night's insanity. But there was one problem. Sebastian. His eyes, hot, intense, unrelenting. Even as she kept her gaze fixed on her notes, she felt him. Watching, owning. She swallowed hard. She couldn't look at him. Because if she did, she'd remember. The feel of his hands gripping her, the way his body pinned hers down, the way he growled her name like a damn prayer. Fuck! She was not thinking about this. Not here. Not while he was sitting at the head of the table, looking like he hadn't just spent the entire night ruining her. Sebastian flipped through the stack of files in front of him, his expression unreadable. But every once in a while, he glanced at her. And when he did, his eyes burned with something dark, something satisfied, something possessive, and then... Lillian! Her heart stopped. She looked up, straight into his deep, knowing gaze. "You're presenting last night's project report." His voice was perfectly calm. Too calm, like he wasn't purposely throwing her into the fire just to watch her squirm. She clenched her jaw, standing quickly. Her pulse was a mess, but her voice, steady, professional, unshaken. Understood. She started her report, forcing herself to focus. But just as she got a few sentences in, Sebastian moved. A slow, deliberate tap of his fingers against the table. Twice. Then he tilted his head slightly, eyes dragging lazily over her, right to her neck. Shit. Lillian bit down on her lip, her fingers clenching the papers in her hand. She knew what he was looking at. She knew what he saw. And when she dared to glance back at him, his lips curled slightly. Not a smirk, a warning. Do not hide from me. Her breath hitched. She narrowed her eyes at him, shooting him a glare. Stop it, right now! But Sebastian? He just leaned back, smirk deepening, completely, shamelessly satisfied. Like he knew exactly what he was doing to her. Lillian inhaled sharply, forcing herself to look away, forcing herself to focus. She had a job to do. She wasn't going to let this man get into her head. Or worse, under her skin. 1 week later, the night falls on Werewolf Congress. The office room was dimly lit, the glow from the city lights casting a sultry hue against the glass windows. The tension between them was thick, suffocating, like a storm brewing just beneath the surface. Lillian let out a sharp breath, her back pressing against the cold edge of her desk as Sebastian loomed over her, his body radiating heat, his scent intoxicatingly masculine and predatory. She shouldn't be here like this. Not at work. Not with him standing this close, his golden wolf eyes darkened with something primal, something dangerous. His fingers curled around the desk beside her, trapping her in place. You've been avoiding me, Sebastian murmured, his voice husky, like whiskey laced with smoke. Lillian swallowed hard. Avoiding him was impossible. Ever since that night, ever since he touched her, owned her, marked her, she hadn't been able to erase the feel of him. His fingers, his mouth, his heat. Now, under the low hum of the office lights, with no one around to stop what was about to happen, she knew she was in trouble. Big trouble. This is my office, she whispered, but even she could hear the breathlessness in her voice, the crack in her resolve. Sebastian let out a low, dangerous chuckle. And yet you're shaking. He moved closer, his knee parting her legs as he pressed her against the desk, his warmth seeping through her thin skirt. Are you scared, Lillian? His voice was rough, teasing, but his eyes were pure hunger. Lillian sucked in a breath as his fingers traced a slow, deliberate path up her thigh, his touch barely there, but scorching hot. She shivered. Not from fear, from something much, much darker. His lips brushed against the shell of her ear, his breath sending shivers down her spine. She really, really should, but she couldn't, because she didn't want him to stop. She wanted more, needed more. Sebastian's sharp canines scraped against her skin, a low growl vibrating in his chest. That's what I thought. Then he was lifting her up, effortlessly placing her onto the desk, spreading her legs with his broad frame before kneeling before her. Her breath hitched. Sebastian, we can't. We already have. And with that, he gripped her thighs, his strong hands pinning her in place as he leaned in, and devoured her. His tongue, his mouth, his relentless hunger. She comes undone beneath him, completely lost in the way he takes her apart, piece by piece. Lillian lay against the desk, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her skin glowing, trembling, hypersensitive. Sebastian lifted his head, his lips glossy with her arousal, his golden eyes burning into hers. He looked satisfied. No, possessive. You're mine, Lillian. Remember this. The way he said it, deep, raw, final, sent another wave of heat rolling through her. Before she could protest, before she could process anything, he was pulling her forward, capturing her lips in a searing, claiming kiss, letting her taste herself on his tongue. She moaned into his mouth, completely undone, completely ruined. And Sebastian? He wasn't nearly done with her yet. That night, Lillian barely made it home before the storm broke loose. Her mind was a mess, her body still humming from what had happened in that office. Sebastian had taken her apart, owned her, worshipped her, right there on her damn desk. And the worst part? She'd let him. No, she'd wanted it. Now, standing in the bathroom, staring at her own flushed reflection in the mirror, she could still feel the ghost of his touch, the roughness of his hands, the heat of his mouth, the way he had looked at her like she was his to claim. Damn him. She turned the faucet on, splashing cool water onto her face, trying to breathe. A mistake. That's what this was. She had to stop this before it spiraled even further out of control. Then, just as she was convincing herself to move on, a knock sounded against her apartment door. Her stomach dropped. No, she already knew who it was. And when she opened the door, she was right. Sebastian stood there, dark-eyed and unreadable, his powerful frame leaning casually against the door frame. But there was nothing casual about the way he looked at her, like he'd come to collect what was his. She swallowed hard. "You shouldn't be here." He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, forcing her to step back. The air between them charged, electric. His scent filled the space around her, dark, masculine, laced with something primal. Her wolf. She wasn't even one of them, but she could feel it, the beast inside him, prowling just beneath the surface, hungry, possessive. "You left." His voice was low, rough, almost accusing. Lillian clenched her hands into fists. "I had to." A slow smirk curled at the edge of his lips. "No, you ran." His fingers traced along her jaw, tilting her chin up so she had no choice but to meet his gaze. "And you know damn well I don't like being run from—" She shivered. "Sebastian." But she didn't get to finish, because he kissed her, hard, possessive, like he was making sure she never even thought about running again. They barely made it past the bathroom door before he had her pinned against the sink, his mouth devouring hers. Her fingers tangled into his hair, pulling, desperate, needing him just as much as he needed her. His voice was dark, gravelly, his hands burning against her skin. She whispered his name, breathless, pleading. That was all it took. Sebastian let go. 1 second, she was standing. The next. Her back was against the cool marble counter, her legs wrapped around his waist, his lips trailing down her neck, his breath hot and ragged against her skin. And then his mouth was on her. Everywhere. Slow, deliberate, until she was begging for more. And he gave it to her. Hard, deep, untamed. The water had long gone cold when Sebastian finally pulled her against him, his arms wrapped tightly around her bare body, his lips pressed against her damp hair. Lillian could barely breathe, could barely think. He had wrecked her, utterly, completely. She should have been scared of what this meant, of what it meant to be claimed by a wolf. Just when Lillian thought she had enough on her plate dealing with whatever the hell was going on between her and Sebastian, fate decided to throw her a curveball. And not just any curveball. It sent her the one person she never wanted to see again. Werewolf Congress, in the High Council meeting room. The room was packed with power. Every core member of the council had gathered to discuss the next phase of the medical reform initiative. Lillian stood just behind Sebastian, keeping her head down, flipping through her notes. But she felt it. The shift in the air. The sudden tension crawling up her spine. Something was off. Sebastian sat at the head of the table, back straight, eyes sharp. The picture of controlled dominance. And sitting across from him, Nathaniel. Lillian's breath hitched. Dark suit, sharp jawline, that same icy arrogance. And fuck, there was no mistaking it. He looked like Sebastian. Her fingers went cold. Because Nathaniel wasn't just any politician. He was her past, Her mistake. The man who once held her heart and then crushed it without a second thought. Who left without looking back. Who disappeared into the political abyss to chase power, to chase the throne. And now he was sitting right in front of her. And worse, he was Sebastian's half-brother. Her stomach dropped. Sebastian must have felt the shift in her energy, because he turned his head just slightly, his voice dropping to that deep, unreadable tone. "You know him?" Lillian's hand clenched around her pen. Her pulse spiked, but before she could even think of a response, Nathaniel spoke first. "It's been a long time, Lillian." The words came out smooth, deliberate, and laced with something too calculated, too amused. A knowing smirk played at the corner of his mouth. And in that instant, the entire room went silent. Lillian's heart slammed against her ribs. And Sebastian? His eyes went dark. "She was mine first," Nathaniel said, his voice calm, controlled. A challenge. "Did she tell you that?" Sebastian's jaw flexed, his muscles tightening as his nails sharpened. His wolf was clawing to get out, ready to rip his brother apart for even daring to speak her name. Lillian stood between them, tense, unsure. She should have never been caught in this. She was supposed to be his. Yet here she was, her past bleeding into their present, threatening to ruin everything. "She is my mate now." Sebastian's voice was low, lethal. "You don't get to talk about her like she still belongs to you." Nathaniel smirked. "And you think you can keep her?" Sebastian let out a slow, rumbling growl. "Try and take her from me, brother. See what happens." And he fucking meant it. After the meeting, they went back to the office. Sebastian didn't speak as he slammed the door behind them, his chest rising and falling with barely contained aggression. Lillian barely had time to react before he grabbed her. She gasped, eyes wide, body still shaking from the confrontation. "Sebastian!" But he was on her before she could finish, pinning her wrists above her head, his golden eyes burning with possessive fury. "You let him touch you once." His voice was rough, deep, dangerous. "I'll kill him before I ever let that happen again." Lillian trembled beneath him, not from fear, from something much, much deeper. "He's not the one I want," she whispered. Something in Sebastian snapped. His lips crashed against hers, punishing, desperate, devouring. His hands ripped at her clothes, his body pressing her deeper into the mattress, his heat branding her skin, his breath hot against her throat. He was claiming her all over again. Hours later, as the moon hung heavy in the sky, Lillian lay tangled in Sebastian's arms, her body aching, marked, satisfied. She knew now, there was no escape. Next, the trap of Nathaniel. Lillian knew something was wrong the moment she stepped into the private suite of the Werewolf High Court. The air was thick, charged with an eerie silence. Too many eyes were on her. Too many whispers. Then she saw him, Sebastian, seated in the center of the grand chamber, his powerful frame restrained by silver chains. His golden eyes calm but seething, like a wolf waiting for the moment to strike. And across from him, standing too comfortably, was Nathaniel, her past, and now, her enemy. The moment their gazes locked, she knew. He had set this up. "You look surprised, Lillian." Nathaniel smirked, his voice smooth, calculated. Her heart pounded. "What did you do?" Nathaniel turned to the council members, voice carrying across the chamber like a perfect lie. "Ladies and gentlemen, our dear Prince, Sebastian, has been accused of treason." The words slammed into her like a death sentence. Treason. Her body turned cold. This was a coup. He sold classified medical research to foreign wolves. Nathaniel continued smoothly, eyes glittering with fake righteousness. Research that could alter wolf genetics, crippling our kind. If that's not betrayal, what is? A murmur rippled through the chamber. It was a well-placed lie. Clever. Designed to destroy Sebastian completely. And Nathaniel wasn't done yet. "But there's a way out of this." He leaned in, so close she could feel his breath against her skin, his voice dropping to a low, private murmur, just for her ears. "Be mine, Lillian. Be my mate, and I'll make sure he walks out of this alive." Her breath hitched. He was trying to take everything. Sebastian's life, his power, and her. Nathaniel smirked. "I loved you first. You were mine before he ever touched you." His fingers brushed her wrist, possessive, claiming. That was his mistake. Because before he could react, she struck. The dagger with poison sliced through the air, straight into Nathaniel's arm. He howled, staggering back, his mask of control shattering. The room erupted into chaos, and in the midst of it, Sebastian moved. Silver chains snapped as he ripped himself free, the raw strength of a true alpha unleashed. His golden eyes blazed with fury, his canines elongating. He had heard everything. Nathaniel staggered, clutching his bleeding arm. His snarl was sharp, but his gaze was wary. "Brother." Sebastian's voice was low, lethal. "You should have stayed in the shadows where you belong." The room tensed. It wasn't just a fight anymore. This was a battle for the throne, a battle for her, and Sebastian wasn't going to lose. Sebastian shifted as quick as wind and destroyed Nathaniel completely. Nathaniel lay broken, gasping, his body sprawled against the marble floor. Sebastian stood over him, his body covered in battle scars, chest heaving, golden eyes glowing. There was no mercy in his gaze. He turned to Lillian, his breathing still ragged. She was shaking, her face pale, but she didn't look away from him. And when he reached for her, she didn't flinch. His hand curled around her wrist, hot, firm, unyielding. "Come with me," he murmured, his voice rough. Her lips parted. "Sebastian." "No more running." A beat of silence. Then, she nodded. And that was all he needed. He lifted her into his arms, carrying her out of the blood-stained room, past the murmuring crowd, past the kingdom he now ruled, past everything, straight into the night where she belonged to him. The moment they were alone, Sebastian didn't wait, didn't hesitate. He pushed her against the wall, his body caging her in, his breath hot against her skin. "Say it," he growled. "Say you're mine." Lillian trembled. "I am always yours." A groan rumbled deep in his chest. Then, his lips crashed into hers. Hard, desperate, unrelenting. His hands slid down her body, gripping, claiming, leaving no doubt that she would never belong to another. And when he lifted her, pressing her against the door, tearing away the barriers between them, she let him, because she was done fighting this. Done fighting him. This was love, war, and surrender all in one, and she wouldn't have it any other way.